I think Bitcoin's greatest risk is its success.
There will be additional sanctions on individuals that are involved in the hijacking.
The time of rhetorics and vocal expression passed. It's over. We need clear actions.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance, Early Edition with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance, the Early Edition on Tuesday, the 25th of May. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and here's what's coming up on today's program. Belarus faces broad sanctions from the EU after forcing a plane to land and to arrest a journalist on board. Ursula von der Leyen calls the act an attack on democracy. Not there yet, Fed officials steer clear of putting a date on taper talk while playing down inflation risks. Stocks and futures gain. And Amazon is set to announce a $9 billion takeover of MGM, bringing James Bond, Rocky, and the Pink Panther into the streaming services library. Now let's get straight to the top market stories with our Danny Berger. Danny, inflationary nerves ebbing today. What are we actually seeing in today's session so far?
Yeah, Francine, it's really interesting because to some degree, and really to a large degree, this isn't a new narrative. This isn't really a new story. So it's fascinating to see that markets globbing on to Fed speakers saying that inflation is going to be transitory is able to have such a big impact on markets. And perhaps that speaks to really the price to perfection sort of scenario that we're living in right now, that anything is really able to catch the narrative and imagination of stock markets. And today, of course, it's that transitory inflation story, which is winning out the day really in over everything. So you have the 10-year yield falling below 1.6%. You have Europe doing well. A lot of that is because Germany's reopened after a day on holiday. And NASDAQ futures, they are the big outperformers. So it's those big, heavily, richly priced sort of names that are outperforming. And then to the downside, you have the dollar still, again, with that wider reflationary narrative. One of the more interesting things, though, is commodities aren't really moving much higher today. They're about unchanged if you look at it as a whole. And a lot of that has to do with China. So that's really the one sort of angle to this inflationary story, which isn't necessarily filtering through today's markets, Francine.
Danny, if you look at BlackRock's Momentum ETF, it's also set to dump a lot of its tech holdings. So what does it mean for the markets?
Yeah, I think that's interesting because if you compare this to what's happening with that Momentum ETF, it shows that a lot of the shift has already happened in the markets. And I think this just really helps us give some perspective. Today's like today when you do have tech doing well, and that's over the past 12 months, it's been value which has been outperforming. So this ETF is going to rebalance based on what those past 12 months have given us. So what has that given us? It means that financial stocks are now a third of the total portfolio, and tech is moving from 40% to 17%. So that's a 23 percentage points reduction. So regardless of what the Fed says, regardless of where we think inflation is going, this reflationary shift in rotation within the market has already happened. And now, sort of as a delayed reaction, it's getting reflected in this ETF, Francine. And this is a $16 billion ETF. So this in itself will surely spur a lot of moves.
Danny, thank you so much. Our Danny Berger there with all of the action on the markets. Now, EU leaders are planning broad economic sanctions against Belarus after it forced a Ryanair flight to land in Minsk. Belarusian authorities arrested a dissident journalist and his partner on the ground in what Ursula von der Leyen called an attack on democracy. Well, joining me is Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo, live from Brussels, who's, of course, been following the EU leaders' summit. Good morning, Maria. So what does a package of measures actually include?
Well, Francine, they're going after the airspace, essentially shutting flights in and out of Belarus, but they're also going after the money. Now, the European Council and the European leaders yesterday making it clear they want to target now new economic sanctions that affect people, but also the state-owned companies in Belarus that they believe are backing financially the regime of Lukashenko. So this takes the financial pressure to a whole new level. Now, behind the scenes, also, Francine, we're being told that this was a package of measures that was approved quickly by EU 27 leaders, that the agreement came about very fast. And this is the part of the optics that European leaders wanted to send to in this message, that when it comes to an external threat, something that they believe is an direct attack on European democracy and also the European airspace, there is no bickering among the EU 27. This was approved very quickly yesterday.
Maria, European leaders also discussing Russia. So how are diplomatic relations on that?
Yes, and Francine, the language that was coming out from the European Commission yesterday and from the head of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, was very tough. It's probably some of the toughest language that we've seen about Russia. She said that for a year now it has been escalating its actions. It is trying to destabilize Eastern European countries. She talked about cyber hacking, meddling in elections, also assassinations carried out that showed that right now having a normal diplomatic relationship with Russia is very difficult. She did say, however, that there is a reality here, and that is that Russia is a big country, is a big geopolitical actor, and geographically is the biggest neighbor to the European Union, so there needs to be some engagement. However, she did also open the door potentially for more measures and more sanctions to happen in June if they don't change behavior.
Maria, thanks so much. Maria Tadeo there joining us, of course, with the very latest on the EU leaders. Now, I'm looking at my terminal because we do have the IFO figures, and I'm delighted to be speaking to Mr. Fuest, very shortly. Germany's IFO Institute released its business climate index for May. It has come stronger than expected at 99.2. The estimate was placed at 98. Now, a little bit later in the program, the IFO president, Clemens Fuest, joins this program after releasing its German business climate index. But up next, more on Belarus, and after Erdogan fires another central bank deputy governor in Turkey. We'll also talk FX with Morgan Stanley's James Lord. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Eastern Europe is once again the nexus of geopolitical tensions on the continent. Belarus is facing broad sanctions from the EU after forcing a plane to land on Sunday and arresting a journalist on board. At the same time, the revolving door at Turkey's central bank sees a new deputy governor installed just 2 months after the governor was replaced. So, is the upheaval increasing volatility in emerging markets? Well, joining us now to discuss all of this is James Lord, Morgan Stanley's global head of FX EM. James, thank you so much, as always, for coming on to speak to us. When you look at EM overall, how bullish are you?
On emerging markets, we're not particularly bullish, to be honest. I mean, we think just like many other asset classes will benefit in the short run from just how dovish the Fed is, and we are expecting the dollar to go on a little bit of a weakening trend in the short run. But I think the medium-term outlook for EM is quite challenging, really. I mean, the asset class, if you think about what's happened in the last 12 months, when every other asset class has really rallied enormously, valuations have become extremely rich when you look across global equities and global credit. Yeah. EM hasn't really participated significantly, and that's because of a lot of underlying sort of bottom-up pressures that the asset class faces, whether it's around politics or whether it's around the lack of growth, the lack of fiscal space. I mean, there are a lot of challenges that EMs face that I think is going to make it difficult for them to stage some kind of late cycle rally, really. So we see this as a temporary phenomenon, and then over the second half of the year, we'd expect the asset class to start weakening against the dollar.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the emerging markets have already underperformed. Is there anything that actually you think has been oversold?
Well, we actually quite like the ruble at these levels. We've seen positioning has been cut back quite substantially during the sort of April period when we saw a lot of concern around sanctions escalation. But we think that now, particularly with the central bank embarking on a pretty decent hiking cycle, I mean, we see them hiking by another 100 basis points or so over the next year. The central bank's pretty hawkish, positioning's quite light. The fundamentals are pretty good, really, for an EM economy. The fundamentals are fantastic, really, for a fixed income investor. We see some opportunity in the ruble now. Clearly, I imagine that there will be questions about what could happen next with respect to the fallout from the Belarus issue, but we don't think it's going to meaningfully affect the value of the ruble, really. So that is one that we quite like.
James, overall, I mean, what's your take on some of these Eastern European countries that used to be satellites? I mean, we look at Belarus, but others. Is there any other values in some of the smaller countries if politics doesn't get in the way, or is it just too risky at the moment?
Well, I mean, the main ones that we cover are all sort of within the EU umbrella, I guess. So, I mean, we like the Polish zloty at the moment. I mean, this is not a currency that is really affected by any particular sort of political turmoil. But relative to other EMs, the fact that Poland is going to be benefiting enormously from the EU Recovery Fund, for example, disbursements on that should be getting underway in the second half of the year. They benefit hugely from, relative to the size of their GDP, Eastern European countries benefit enormously from inflows related to the EU Recovery Fund. And we think Polish zloty is pretty cheap. It's kind of lagged some of its other Central Eastern European peers recently. There's a bit of concern about the Supreme Court decision about the Swiss franc mortgage issue, but again, we think it's quite well flagged, it's reasonably priced, and so we think Polish zloty can also do quite well. So we're short euro versus the zloty.
James, what do you do with Turkish lira right now? I mean, we have another reshuffle from the deputy governor this time.
Yeah, another reshuffle. I mean, we've been recommending to clients to be long dollar Turkey. I mean, this is a sort of long-standing trade of ours. Our economists are expecting to see 300 basis points of rate cuts later in the year. Inflation is still a bit of an issue. It's still quite sticky to the top side, and the tourism season is very uncertain. I mean, Turkey's only a month or so ago was running some pretty high COVID infection rates. The vaccination campaign is underway, but a long way from being completed, and there is uncertainty about what kind of arrangements will be in place for international travel. So I think Turkey could be facing another difficult tourism season. There's definitely a risk around that. And I think if you mix in a few hundred basis points of rate cuts and high inflation, for us, I think the risk reward favors being long dollars. So that is one that one EM currency that we're not big fans of at the moment.
James, I know if you look at some of the other countries, I mean, you're steering clear of Colombia, Bahrain, I think Sri Lanka, but like Saudi Arabia. I mean, how is that also influenced by COVID-19, or is that actually just on structural reforms and structural changes?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Colombia, and I think that's an interesting country given the ratings downgrade that we saw recently, and we're kind of underweight Latin America in general, really. We see a lot of kind of growth pressures in Latin America. We see the post-pandemic recovery being the weakest of the three regions, underperforming Asia and CEMEA. And there are big social pressures as well. We can see with the recent protests and the backlash against the government's proposed tax reforms that it's difficult for countries facing these social issues to really implement the kind of fiscal stabilization measures that markets are looking for. So Colombia is not the only country where you see that kind of pressure from the public coming up. We saw with the elections in Chile that people are demanding change there as well. We've got elections coming up in Brazil and also in Mexico. So I think Latin America is a region that I think for investors is going to be quite challenging from a political standpoint, and in the face of needed fiscal consolidation and weak growth. So we're kind of underweight Latin America. We're short the Colombian peso. We're not particularly big fans of Brazilian real at the moment. So yeah, I think LATAM is an interesting region and one that will probably underperform the other two.
James, thank you so much. James Lord there, Morgan Stanley Global Head of FX EM. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. The US has issued a new travel warning saying Americans should avoid going to Japan. It adds to the doubts about Tokyo's plans to host the Olympics in less than 2 months' time. The action comes despite a far lower infection rate in Japan than in the US. Much of Japan is still under a state of emergency. Now, the Bank of England is playing down the risk of runaway inflation. Governor Andrew Bailey says the expected acceleration in prices this year will likely be temporary. That was echoed by one of his deputies, John Cunliffe, who says inflation will return to the bank's 2% target as growth does slow. The UK is starting formal preparations for a free trade deal with India. It wants to begin negotiations later in the year as Prime Minister Boris Johnson seeks to prove the benefits of leaving the EU. The UK and India want to double trade between the two countries by 2030. Back in 2019, it was worth about £23 billion. Global news 24 hours a day on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Leanne Gerrans. This is Bloomberg. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now, Germany's IFO Institute releases its latest business climate index for May. It has beaten estimates. How is the economic engine of Europe faring? Up next, we speak to the IFO Institute president, Clemens Fuest. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, the early edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, the outlook for Europe's largest economy seems brighter. Germany's IFO Institute released its business climate index for May. It has come in stronger than expected at 99.2. The estimate was placed at 98. It has also beaten the April figure of 96.8. But what does it all mean for the continent at large? Well, joining us now is Clemens Fuest. He's the IFO Institute president. Thank you so much, Mr. Fuest, for joining us. As always, when you look at exactly what happens to the German economy, so restrictions have been lifted, things are getting slowly back to normal. What kind of recovery are you now expecting? Are people spending? Can you see already patterns that you think will continue in the future?
Well, it's starting. What we see this time is that there is increasing optimism in the sectors that were most affected by the pandemic. Tourism, hospitality, retail. The spending still has to come because we are just at the beginning of the opening process. But the companies are expecting improved business in the months to come, and that's what we expect too.
When you look at, some of the output, how much are you actually expecting the output to rebound?
So we're expecting output to grow by 2.6% in the second quarter and something similar in the third quarter after the contraction in the first. So this is a recovery. We expect pre-crisis level to be reached at the beginning of 2022. So a strong upturn in the second and third quarter. There are some risks there. One is intermediate goods like semiconductors and other parts, commodities getting scarce and expensive, and this is kind of holding back manufacturing, where things have been going very well for some time. We also see this in the construction industry, where some materials like wood are getting more expensive, so there are some risks for this upturn, but in general, the picture is fairly bright.
Right, but so on this, actually, how much of a risk is it to the economy, both the fact that materials are hard to come by and that there are risks to the supply chain?
Well, it's certainly a significant risk. Most companies are expecting to pass on these prices to consumers, and it remains to be seen whether consumers accept that and whether that will have an impact on demand. But in general, this certainly is a limiting factor. At the same time, there is a lot of potential for recovery in the most affected sectors like hospitality, retail, and so on. So this is just coming, which means overall we don't expect the recovery to be held back completely by these shortages, but they're certainly a dampening factor.
What are you expecting in terms of vaccine passports or everything that's kind of being discussed at the moment? Would that give a boost to Germany at the margins because people will feel confident about the future, or do you think it makes little difference actually?
I think the impact will be limited. There will be more opening up of the domestic economy. The vaccination passport is more about traveling, very important for the southern European countries, and indirectly the recovery of southern Europe will then have an impact on Germany because it's an important export destination, but that will be later in the year. So for the domestic economy in Germany, the vaccination passport is less important.
Mr. Fuest, overall, when you look at the pace of vaccination in Europe, do you think that Europe will be able to catch up with other parts of the world? And does that, just make it a lot easier, or do geopolitics and also what happened in Belarus put a dampener on things because Europe is once again faced with very hard questions?
I think the Belarus crisis will not be a problem for the economic recovery. The vaccination progress will. Europe catches up at the moment, but we already see that there continue to be shortages in the availability of vaccines, and at the same time, the number of people willing to be vaccinated is declining among those who haven't been vaccinating yet. So increasingly, we see people who have concerns about the vaccine, so that the overall vaccination process will slow down. It's something we see in the US and the UK as well. And that will leave some uncertainty about infection numbers in the months to come.
Mr. Fuest, thanks so much as always. Clemens Fuest, their IFO Institute president. Now, don't miss our coverage on the upcoming German elections right here at Bloomberg. 11 a.m. London time, we'll hear from the finance minister, Olaf Scholz. If you want to listen into that conversation, type LIVE GO on your Bloomberg terminal. This is Bloomberg. Belarus faces broad sanctions from the EU after forcing a plane to land to arrest a journalist on board. Ursula von der Leyen calls the act an attack on democracy. Not there yet, Fed officials steer clear of putting a date on taper talk while playing down inflation risks. Stocks and futures gain. And Amazon is set to announce a $9 billion takeover of MGM, bringing James Bond, Rocky, and the Pink Panther into the streaming services library. I'm actually a huge fan of all three. Disclaimer. Now, good morning. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and welcome to Bloomberg Surveillance, the early edition on this Tuesday, the 25th of May. European stocks moving higher this morning, led by German stocks, which were closed yesterday for a holiday. Let's get through the individual stocks, really, that are moving higher. Danny, we want to get through the movers. I also need to speak to you about the Pink Panther and Amazon, because that's a whole other, board game, and it kind of makes us want to watch old movies again.
It does. Also, I don't know if anyone caught it, but that graphic you showed at the start was James Bond, but with Jeff Bezos' head. I'm so obsessed with it. The Surveillance Early Edition team makes the best graphics. That says everything you know there. Yeah, exactly. Okay, look, Amazon, of course, that's going to be the talk of the day. But when it comes to European markets, it's really all about Germany. I mean, you mentioned it was closed yesterday, reopened today. And because of that, it is trading at a new record. Swiss stocks trading at a new record as well. So here's another deal. I have to admit, it's not as exciting as Amazon possibly buying MGM, but it is still the biggest real estate deal ever in Europe. So for that reason, we have to be somewhat excited about it. And it's Deutsche Wohnen. So they're being bought by Vonovia. This is a $19 billion euro deal, rather. So of course, because of that, Deutsche Wohnen, which is being bought around 53 euros, is trading higher, not quite at that price yet. And as we usually see, the company that's buying the acquisition target is moving lower because, of course, there are those costs associated with integrating a new company. So Vonovia down about 4%. And finally, Royal Mail, this is a company which is well known across the entirety of the UK, but it had lost its blue chip status in 2018, falling off the FTSE 100. It had become too small. Well, Royal Mail has really changed their tactics, focusing on parcels during the COVID pandemic. And because of that, they've seen really strong earnings. Their share prices have rallied. And now Liberium says that they are set to be included once again in the FTSE 100. We get the results of that rebalancing later today, Francine.
Danny, thank you so much. Danny Berger there with some of the main stock movers. Now, Deutsche Bank's AGM is this Thursday. The chief executive, Christian Sewing, is expected to highlight the turnaround at Germany's largest lender. Now, it's a far cry from the shareholder angst that he faced 2 years ago, as the bank remained shackled with the Sick Men of Europe finance tag. Now, we've taken a deep dive into the recent changes at Deutsche in today's Big Take on the Bloomberg terminal and website. And I have to say, it's a great story, well thought out, well written, and I urge everyone to go and read it on the terminal or also on our website. Now, for more, let's talk to our Bloomberg banking reporter who's worked extensively on the story. He's Stephen Arons. Stephen, good morning. So first of all, how did Sewing actually turn Deutsche Bank around?
Hey, good morning. Well, I think one important step he's taken is to end what was previously heavy infighting on the management board. Top leadership they hated each other for a long period of time. Sewing has ended that. He put in place people loyal to him, and they have helped him implement a strategy that was difficult previously too. previous plans failed because they were big words but little action. That has changed on the Seving, but, and that's an important but, he's also been very lucky. Seving has been riding a trading boom, and Danny just mentioned the DAX, the German benchmark index, rising to a new high. All of the market buoyancy has helped Deutsche Bank a lot too.
So how stable is Deutsche Bank now?
It's if you compare it to previously, very stable. It's a sort of a bank like other banks in that respect. It's got solid capital buffers. The concern that was surrounding Deutsche Bank for a very long time has dissipated. It's not being questioned. The viability of the bank is not being questioned anymore by credit investors, for example. If you compare credit spreads of Deutsche Bank to competitors, then there's not a big difference anymore. So from a stability perspective, you can consider it a viable bank, yeah.
So I know, we tend to, Steve, ask you whether this will ever be a normal bank. I mean, I don't know what normal, define normal is like a whole other show, which will take us 2 hours, but will it get to something that I guess is more templated?
Yeah, I mean, normal, I guess, is something that doesn't stand out in a negative or sometimes in a positive way in comparison to other banks. And that was the case negatively for Deutsche Bank for a very long time. We talked about in the story, we talked about the dysfunctional decade. And it's true, Deutsche Bank was seen as the sick man of Europe for the better part of a decade, really. And that is no longer the case. People still pay a lot of attention to the bank. And as we write in the story, people are concerned the next accident is just around the corner potentially, but it's not like there is negative news about the bank all the time. It's not always Deutsche Bank anymore. So it's become more of a normal bank. And if the CEO now restores sustainable profitability to the bank over the next, 3 years or something, then yeah, I think people won't consider it a dysnormal bank anymore.
Stephen, thank you so much. Bloomberg's banks reporter Stephen Arons there joining us on this great big take, which you can find again on the terminal, but also on our website. It's a big take story on Bloomberg.com. It's NI Big Take Go if you need the function on the Bloomberg terminal. Now, coming up, European leaders are promising tough sanctions after Belarusian authorities forced a Ryanair flight to land in order to make an arrest. We'll have the latest next. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now let's get straight to your Bloomberg Business Flash. Here's Leanne Gerrans. Hi, Leanne.
Hi, Francine. It is the biggest ever takeover in European real estate. German residential property firm Vonovia has agreed to acquire rival Deutsche Wohnen for 19 billion euros. The bid price represents a premium of some 18% over the target's closing price on Friday, when shares were last actually traded. The deal brings together the two largest residential landlords, which control more than 500,000 apartments. Now, payment processing firm Square is quietly preparing to offer savings and current accounts, taking direct aim at the big banks. Evidence of the plan, not actually yet announced, appeared in hidden code in a recent update to the company's smartphone app. It also suggests that Square will set itself apart by shunning monthly service charges and fees tied to minimum balances and overdrafts. Morgan Stanley has reached a deal to end a lawsuit which alleged discrimination against black female staff. Longtime employee Marilyn Booker, who became the bank's first global head of diversity, sued the firm last year, saying management had refused to adopt her plans to address racial bias. She said the bank failed to address problems with hiring and retaining black employees. Morgan Stanley has strongly rejected Booker's claims and vowed to defend the lawsuit. And that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Francine.
Leanne, thank you so much. Now, European leaders are reacting to the Belarusian government forcing a Ryanair flight to land in Minsk in order to arrest a dissident journalist, calling it an outrage.
What has happened here, this is unseen.
It's an international scandal.
I think hijacking the plane and behaving like that, it is the act of terror.
The European Council decided that there will be additional sanctions on individuals that are involved in the hijacking, but this time also on businesses and economic entities that are financing this regime.
Particularly also against companies, so therefore we need more economic sanctions and entities supporting the regime.
We need clear actions in order to change the pattern of behavior of this very dangerous regime.
Well, the EU is now promising broad economic sanctions to what it says amounts to hijacking. Joining me now is Ross Matheson, Bloomberg's international government editor. Good morning, Ross. I know that there hasn't been a shortage of political news, but how is the U.S. actually responding to this issue?
Well, President Joe Biden has, like others, condemned the actions of Belarus. He's called it a direct affront to international norms, and he's asked his advisors to come up with options to respond, but it's unclear at this stage what those might be. They would likely mirror, to some extent, whatever the Europeans do, and right now the EU is kicking the can down the road at least a month on sanctions, let alone broader penalties for business and the economy. So you wouldn't expect anything necessarily from the White House either for at least a month on this. And the question then is how much or whether any action taken by the EU and the US actually changes things, because Belarus is already heavily sanctioned, and that's not stopped the President Lukashenko from tightening his grip at home and cracking down on dissent.
So, Rosa, are we seeing any sign that it might actually affect the prospects for a Putin-Biden summit next month?
For now, no. That's even, of course, as Russia strongly lines up behind Belarus on this one. You can see the expressions of support today, and President Vladimir Putin is reportedly going to meet with Lukashenko later this week. So potentially complicates things, but then again, it's already a very complicated relationship with lots of challenges. You've got Ukraine, you've got hacking, election meddling, the jailing of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, and so on. And despite that, there's a real eagerness on both sides, it seems, to have this meeting. For Putin, it gives him recognition as a leader who still matters. And for Joe Biden, of course, he's trying to thread the needle with Russia because they do need to work together on issues like Iran. And he may be wary about Russia and China drawing closer together and excluding the US. So for now, it looks like planning is going ahead for a meeting potentially in Geneva around the middle of next month.
Ross, thank you so much. As always, Ross Matheson there, our Bloomberg International Government editor. You can also follow everything that she edits and writes on the website and our terminal. Now, joining us is Emre Peker, Director of Europe Team at Eurasia. Emre, thank you so much for joining us, because this is, I guess, a hot political potato, which the EU is trying to deal with. But does it make any difference if they don't persuade also Russia to be on their side?
Thanks for having me on, Francine. No, without Russia, it's going to be very difficult, because over the past year, essentially, the Lukashenko regime has turned increasingly into a pawn of President Vladimir Putin, a relationship which will be forged even closer when the two leaders meet in Sochi on Friday. So in essence, the decision by the EU to also go after entities and businesses linked to the regime and the financing of the government in Minsk will only increase Lukashenko's dependency on Putin and arguably deteriorate even further the EU's ability to influence events in Belarus.
But Emre, at some point, I mean, are Lukashenko and Putin, very, very close? I know there was a summit, and it really, it points to the embracement of the two countries. But at some point, does Belarus become too difficult for Putin to deal with?
Lukashenko doesn't have any friends at the moment, so I think he's quite dependent. And the financing question is a whole other issue. And if the EU cuts off funds as one of its biggest export markets, that will definitely hit the Minsk regime negatively. But at the same time, the EU also has this ambition and desire to keep contact with civil society in Belarus, to support the opposition, to support democratic process in the country. But the more the EU constrains Belarus by banning flights to and from Belarus, by closing its airspace to Belarus, by restraining its finances, the more difficult it will be to exercise any levers to win over Lukashenko too.
But Emery, does the EU, can they actually affect change in Belarus? And if they can't, then will this inspire or give a green light to other regimes to do the same, like hijack planes and actually take dissidents or journalists off them?
I think this punishment will be severe enough that it will be a clear warning sign. I mean, let's not, the proof will be in the pudding, right? Because the leaders have said that entities will be sanctioned, but we haven't yet seen to what extent and how severely the EU will go after the financing mechanisms of the Belarusian regime. So the question is, once the EU acts, and considering how swiftly they have acted within 24 hours, effectively almost, that's a clear signal to a lot of other similarly minded capitals to be careful, especially if their economies are exposed to that of the EU.
If the US doesn't get involved, though, does it have quite the same teeth? Is the EU now better off trying to get Washington to be involved in this, to make sure that, it's dealt with in a way that there's almost, no doing it again?
Yeah, I mean, so far, what we've seen from Washington is taking a backseat to Brussels and deferring to the EU. They wanted their European allies to be at the forefront of the reaction to Belarus, given the geographic proximity and closer relations. So given the size of the country and its relatively small importance, it's difficult to see what further the US can do other than matching what the EU is doing, also along with the UK, obviously.
Emery, when we look at what's happened over the last 5 to 6 years, I guess the political instability in Eastern Europe with Crimea, with Ukraine, has been pretty incredible. Does that continue to escalate no matter what happens with Belarus?
That's the big question for the EU, and essentially, if it weren't for the Ryanair hijacking, it was going to be one of the main themes last night, how the EU tackles its problems with Russia. That discussion has been punted off to June now, with the leaders requesting yet another report on the Russia strategy from their diplomatic services. So I would reckon that going forward, the Eastern Front is going to continue being problematic for the EU. Russia has a knack for maintaining these frozen conflicts, be it over Nagorno-Karabakh, be it in Georgia and South Ossetia, be it in Ukraine and Moldova, to play into differences in the EU and destabilize the region. And I struggle to see a mechanism by which the EU can really strengthen its resolve vis-a-vis Russia to bring an end to these circumstances.
Emery, thank you so much for joining us. Emery Pecker, the Eurasia Director of Europe team. Now, coming up, Amazon could announce an acquisition of MGM, the studio of Gone with the Wind and Rocky, as soon as today. That's according to Bloomberg sources. Well, we'll get the latest on that. This is Bloomberg. Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Amazon could announce an acquisition of MGM, the studio of Gone with the Wind and Rocky, as soon as today. Bloomberg sources say the e-commerce giant is set to pay nearly $9 billion for the business. The agreement would bring a vast library of movies and shows to Amazon, which operates the Prime Video streaming service. Well, let's get more now with Bloomberg Intelligence's Matthew Bloxham. Matt, good morning. The Amazon Prime Video service, already pretty successful. Why are they doing this deal?
Yeah, hi, Francine. Yeah, as you say, I mean, there are over 200 million Prime subscribers now, and recently in April they said that about 175 million of those in the last year had watched videos and streaming hours were up 70% year on year. So it is successful, but I guess they continue to look for growth in the overall Prime service. It's a hugely valuable part of the Amazon ecosystem. I guess having a more interesting, valuable, strong streaming service is a way to kind of convince existing Prime subscribers to stay with the service and maybe a hook to kind of help keep growing that total of 200 million. So I think Prime is a kind of very rich service. Obviously, a big part of it is the kind of free delivery, either 24 or 48 hours, but things like video are potentially increasingly important to keep the momentum going for growing that customer base.
How much, Matt, will this deal actually change the streaming landscape?
I think in the short term, probably not. I mean, clearly Netflix and Disney are the leaders in terms of the breadth of content and the success they're having at the moment. But I think it's going to be interesting to watch to see what Amazon actually does, not just with this acquisition, but with things like the deal they've done with the NFL on sports rights, and whether they buy more sports rights internationally, and whether they look to kind of package that up to kind of really give Prime Video a sharper edge, a clearer focus. This is why you should buy this service. I don't think it's quite there yet, but they could do some interesting things. They could make a lot more of some of the franchises like James Bond, Rocky, for example, to kind of really kind of create some stronger communities and focus for that service. So I think definitely Netflix and Disney will be looking at this closely, and it may be something that evolves over the next 2 or 3 years to give Prime Video that sharper edge.
Do you think, Matt, this is just the beginning of more consolidation in the sector? I mean, already, this landscape has gone through huge shifts and changes.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we may even see a bit more expansion before we see contraction. I mean, in Europe, there are local streaming services that are still coming to market and expanding into new territories. I think, ultimately it's going to consolidate. I think, consumers in the next 2 to 3 years are going to start to question, why am I paying $15 a month for that service, $10 a month for that one, $8 for that one, and we'll look to kind of consolidate what they're spending their money on. So I think, the next 2-3 years, definitely, I think we're going to see a lot more consolidation, but we may also see some of these US players look to strengthen their investments in some of these regional players, for example, in Europe, to strengthen the locally originated content they've got in their offering. So there might be less players, but they might be bulking up in other parts of the world as well as in the US over the next 2 or 3 years.
Matt, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Matthew Bloxham there. Now, this is the picture for the markets. A lot of the focus, of course, is what we also heard from Fed governors. So we'll look at treasuries. We'll also look at some of the tech companies. Bitcoin, never far from focus. I know our Danny Berger had a great recap of some of the main things that we're watching out for. But it's very clear that some of the Fed comments on inflation buoyed the markets. Now, if you look at exactly, what we've heard from officials, they've continuously played down some of the risk of persistent inflation. I'm looking at a gauge of dollar strength against a basket of peers, and it's actually headed for the lowest level since January. So we'll look at that. We'll also look at treasuries and some of the upcoming economic data. Bitcoin holding on to gains after Elon Musk's efforts to bolster the credentials of green stoked a rally. Now, Smart Conversations continue on Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. In the next hour, we'll speak about Belarus to the Pulitzer Prize-winning author and John Hopkins Senior Fellow and Applebound. That's it. Matt Miller joins me out of Berlin, Kailey Leinz out of New York. This is Bloomberg.
This is not acceptable, and it's why we put the debate on sanctions on the table.
There will be additional sanctions on individuals that are involved in the hijacking.
The time of rhetorics and vocal expression passed. It's over. We need clear actions.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition with Francine Lacqua, Matt Miller, and Kailey Leinz.
Well, good morning from London, Berlin, and New York. Our top stories today. Belarus faces broad sanctions from the EU after forcing a plane to land to arrest a journalist on board. Ursula von der Leyen calls the attack an attack on democracy. Well, Elon Musk's push to boost Bitcoin's green credentials spurs another rally in the cryptocurrency, but it trims gains this morning. And Amazon is set to announce a $9 billion takeover of MGM, bringing James Bond, Rocky, and the Pink Panther into the streaming services library. Kailey, I know we'll spend a big amount of time actually looking at Amazon, looking at the streaming services. It's just made me want to watch old movies, but we always watch the markets first.
Yeah, of course we do, Francine. Of course, there are those idiosyncratic stories, but broadly speaking, I would say inflation fears seem to be easing in markets really across the world. That was evident in the Asian session, where most stocks were higher, including in Japan and Hong Kong. But Chinese stocks are actually the ones that really outperformed, with the CSI 300 rallying more than 3%. And that was really driven by consumer stocks, the likes of Qichao Mutai, the liquor giant, which rallied 6% on the day. And it wasn't just stocks that were rallying. The Chinese currency was as well, reaching its strongest against the dollar since June of 2018, so almost 3 years. Of course, this is as China is trying to crack down on that commodity rally. That may be easing inflation fears a bit, and I would note iron ore futures in the Asian session essentially unchanged. As for what the picture looks like here in the U.S., we saw strong rallies yesterday led by big tech. And once again, that seems to be the case this morning. NASDAQ 100 futures outperforming up about 0.5%. Of course, that is, again, as inflation fears ease. And we can see that evident in the bond market as well, with the 10-year yield moving lower by about a basis point. But we are sub 160, actually at 1.5876% at the moment. It is a broadly weaker dollar story this morning. And then, of course, we can't avoid talking about Bitcoin, even if you might be tired of it, Matt Miller. Elon Musk once again wielding his power over the cryptocurrency, saying he talked to some Bitcoin miners in North America yesterday, potentially promising. That saw Bitcoin rally up toward $39,000, but we're coming off that level now, trading at $38,200 or so. Matt, what are you watching in Europe?
If I'm tired of it, then everyone must be tired of it, right? Because I have been obsessed with cryptocurrencies for the past 10 years, but I'm just sick of watching this volatility, hearing Elon Musk tweet about it, moving the markets around, and then people talk about Dogecoin as if it were a serious thing. So it gets to me a little bit. Here you can see European markets are up pretty much across the board. We see gains in Europe, France, and the UK, little changed right now, but you see big green areas there in the Iberian Peninsula, as well as especially here in Germany. Take a look at the Stoxx 600. You can see gains there, as well as gains in the currencies. The euro is a gainer today. The pound, look at this, 140.190. A little earlier I checked, it was well over 142. And if it closes at that level, it'll be the highest that it's closed since April of 2018. So dollar weakness really showing through against European and British currencies. I guess we can't call British currencies European currencies. There is the big mover in Germany at the bottom of your screen. You can see Deutsche Wohnen up 16% right now. Vonovia is down almost 5%. It has been down more after they made an offer for Deutsche Wohnen at $23 billion. Now, this is a big deal, Francine, not only because it's the biggest real estate M&A deal ever here in Europe, but because prices in Germany are already incredibly high. So it's a social issue here. You know, it's no secret that I was looking for places in Bronxville, in Greenwich, hoping to move back to Westchester. My wife nixed that very quickly. But main reason is that I want to buy a house that's cheaper than here in Berlin. Prices here for big houses are more than they cost in the tri-state area. So this is why this real estate takeover is such a big deal.
Wait, there's so much to unpack, Matt. First of all, affordable housing. The fact that you're over Bitcoin is also probably, this is like peak. This is like peak Bitcoin. But we have to look at NFTs because, okay, Ether, good one. We'll talk about Ether. And did you see the NFT with, Charlie Bit My Finger that sold yesterday for about £500,000?
Unbelievable.
NFT,
Truly
the new
unbelievable.
Bitcoin. Now, a look at what else is ahead today. And in 1 hour, Bloomberg's Stephanie Flanders has an exclusive conversation with the German Finance Minister, Olaf Scholz, who's running for Chancellor in the upcoming German elections. So Matt will also be all over this. We'll look at polling. We'll look at what happens actually in the next German election, which is slated for September. 7:30 a.m. New York time, the Bank of Japan hosts a panel discussion on policy changes and challenges. Speakers include the ECB Chief Economist Philip Lane and the Riksbank Governor Stefan Ingves. invest. Another central bank event. A Fed Vice Chair for Supervision, Randall Quarles, gives his testimony before the U.S. Senate Banking Committee. And finally, it's 1 year since the murder of George Floyd, and President Joe Biden is set today as a deadline to overhaul U.S. policing practices. So, of course, we need to we'll stay on it and see why it's taken so long for something to be achieved. Now, EU leaders are planning broad economic sanctions against Belarus after it forced a Ryanair flight to land in Minsk. Belarusian authorities arrested a dissident journalist and his partner on the ground in what Ursula von der Leyen called an attack on democracy. Well, Bloomberg's Maria Tadeo joins us out of Brussels. Maria, with the extra sanctions on Belarus, without the support of the White House, will they actually make much of a difference?
Well, Francine, the Europeans believe they will, because on the one hand, if you move away from just shutting the airspace, the in and out flights out of Belarus, and you focus on the financial, this is now going after individuals who may be close to Lukashenko, financing that regime. And it's also going after the state companies, which is where Europeans believe really the money is at to finance and keep Lukashenko in power. So they do believe that this is going to exert pressure on Belarus and is going to further isolate the government of Belarus. In terms of the United States, you know, the Europeans did believe that this was something that they have to decide for themselves. This was not an issue for the United States to intervene, because it was very much about the European airspace. It was very much about ensuring the European safety, but it was also about sending a message of power, force from the European Union when it comes to Belarus and by extension Russia, that the EU is ready to take measures when it's attacked.
All right, Maria, thanks very much. Maria Tadeo continuing to cover that. I think she's covering it 24 hours a day. I saw her sending messages around midnight last night. So good morning to you. Meanwhile, sources are telling Bloomberg that Amazon is poised to announce its acquisition of the MGM movie studio as soon as today. The expected price tag there, almost $9 billion. And it's not just the price tag. Obviously, it's such a widely held stock. We all want to know what's going on at Amazon. Let's get more from Bloomberg's Danny Berger. Danny?
Matt, I mean, look, this is so fascinating. You have this company that's really the epitome of the modern company buying a film studio that was founded in the silent era. So it's really these two worlds coming together. And part of what Amazon is doing here, really the largest part of what Amazon is likely hoping for, is that it can beef up its Prime offering. Of course, we have the ongoing streaming wars. But if you put this in the context of its other large deal, which was buying Whole Foods, that's going to be the biggest deal that they've done. This would be the second biggest deal should it go through. It just shows how they're really trying to keep customers coming to Prime and adding new customers in as well. So, of course, this means people are going to get access to the Bond film franchise, RoboCop, if that's what people are interested in, but really here concentrating on having more proprietary content after. That's definitely what people are interested in. It's what I'm interested in. But, you know, they've already also put their bid in for Thursday night football as well from the NFL. So this is just more that Amazon is trying to do and trying to add to its Prime services.
Yeah, waiting for the day I can watch my Denver Broncos on Amazon streaming. Bloomberg's Danny Berger, thank you so much. Now let's turn to Bitcoin. It has trimmed some of its gains after a rally caused once again by Elon Musk's tweets. The Tesla founder signaled support for initiatives to make Bitcoin miners more environmentally friendly. But it wasn't just Musk. The cryptocurrency has also gotten a boost from Bridgewater Associates founder Ray Dalio.
I think Bitcoin's greatest risk is its success. The more we create savings in it, the more you might say, I'd rather have Bitcoin than the bond. Personally, I'd rather have Bitcoin than a bond. And then the more that happens, then it goes into Bitcoin and it doesn't go into credit, and then they lose control of it. So yeah, that's a risk.
Bloomberg's Joanna Ossinger tracks every move in the crypto space, and she joins us now. Joanna, does tracking every move in the crypto space also mean you have to very closely monitor Elon Musk's Twitter account?
It does, actually. So I was watching the tweets about Dogecoin offering dogs and memes today, for instance. But yes, Elon is once again at it. He just wants to, he says he wants Bitcoin to be more environmentally friendly. So he met with this group of North American miners. And he did say when he became disenchanted with Bitcoin because of the energy usage, that there was an opening. He wanted to see if they could be better for the environment. This looks like they're on track to do it. Some of the miners, of course, it's some North American miners, it's not all, and many miners are in China and other places as well. But it looks like it might be a start toward miners trying to account for their energy usage and adding in some more renewables.
All right, Bloomberg cross-asset reporter and Asia crypto czar, Joanna Ossinger, thank you so much. Now, I do want to take a quick check on some stocks moving in pre-market trading here in the U.S. One of the big outperformers to the upside is actually Tellurian, which, of course, is an LNG company. Shares are up about 3.6% after it was raised to a buy at DNB Markets. The analysts put a $4.40 price target on the stock. It's trading at $2.86 this morning. Not moving to the upside, though, is Lordstown Motors, ticker RIDE. It reported after the bell last night, and it cut its production target basically in half for its pickups. It also said it's going to need more capital to execute on its goals. As a result, the shares plunging more than 16%. And also moving to the downside is Virgin Galactic, Richard Branson's space company. It rallied 28% yesterday after a successful space flight over the weekend, but coming a bit more back to earth this morning with shares down about 3% before the bell, Francine.
Yeah, we have so much to look at. Also keeping an eye on football, actually, with some pretty cryptic Cristiano Ronaldo posts. I know Matt Miller will be all over that. Now, coming up next, we talk markets with Mark Haefele, Chief Investment Officer at UBS Global Wealth Management. And then a little bit later on Belarus, we'll talk to the prize-winning historian Anne Applebaum of Johns Hopkins. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller in Berlin with Francine Lacqua in London, Kailey Leinz in New York. Now, I have a pretty incredible chart that Hillary put together for us, my erstwhile producer there. Because of our next guest's notes, it prompted me to look in to the yield on S&P 500 stocks. And I'll just walk our radio listeners through this. If you take out inflation, the yield on S&P 500 stocks has dropped below zero and has set a 40-year low. So we're looking at, well, I can't believe I'm so far over 40, the lowest since the early 80s. It's just pretty incredible. Mark Haefele joins us now, Chief Investment Officer at UBS Global Wealth Management. Mark, your notes prompted me to look at this. Still, S&P 500 stocks are yielding more than 10-year treasuries, of course, because inflation-adjusted yields there are even lower. But doesn't it concern you a little bit that we've gotten to this level?
Well, look, I mean, I think that there are risks in the market, and the fact that we're 20% above where we were before the pandemic does have a lot of our clients wanting to pause here. But I think we see some positive signs. One is what you just described in the fancy term, right, is the equity risk premium, and that still looks attractive compared to the alternatives like treasuries. And second, don't forget the monster earnings season that we're having. We're expecting S&P earnings to increase by 40% this year. And finally, many people still don't believe in the reflation that we're going to get out of this pandemic, and we do.
What is the one, Mark, so what kind of inflation expectations are you actually seeing? Is the market mispricing what we'll see?
Well, we think that in our central case that we're actually going to have peak inflation around now, and it's going to start to fall back again. But, even if you get a little more inflation pressure, I think that plays into our theme that you want to stay in the stocks, but more the stocks that are positioned for reflation, such as energy, financials, and materials.
You remain positive on the outlook for global equities, but if inflation surprises and we have a lot more volatility, how bumpy will it be ahead, Mark?
How bumpy is always difficult to predict, but I think if you think about a path towards that higher inflation and those fears persisting, this is still an environment where we have seen equities remain strong, particularly, I think, the momentum over the past 6 months is going to lead a lot of the quant funds. Some of the things we're seeing in our quant work is to continue that pressure towards the value, towards the sectors away from kind of the mega cap tech. So I think under the indexes, that rotation would continue even if the volatility picked up.
Inside of that rotation, Mark, what still looks cheap?
Well, yes, cheap is a relative word, but I think that this energy trade, the materials, the smaller caps all trade at much better valuations. I mean, we think that S&P 500 is at about 17.5 times forward 2022 earnings, whereas big cap tech is more like in the 27 times. So while that's not in and of itself, without looking at bond yields and reflation, not necessarily cheap, I think the valuation disparity means that a lot of people need to rotate because they just have too much tech still.
And Mark, in an environment where inflation may be peaking, what's your best hedge? Can Bitcoin serve that role?
Well, we're not at the stage where we think Bitcoin is a great place in most people's asset allocations. And I think, one of the things you all just said was you got to track every move in crypto, including people's tweets. And for most people, that's probably not the best use of their time. There's much better things they could be doing with their asset allocation.
We did see Mark Dalio say he'd rather own Bitcoin than bonds, which surprised me, I have to say, although I talked to a millennial friend this weekend who said he was drinking beers in the park here in Berlin listening to a Ray Dalio podcast. So I guess he's become part of pop culture, Ray has. What do you think about that position, rather owning Bitcoin than bonds?
Well, I listened to that clip, and I think what I got out of it's interesting. Everybody gets a different thing in this world today from the clips they see. But what I heard him say is that it could be a victim of its own success in the fact that if you get a significant rotation, one of the few things that China and the United States agree on is that crypto assets are potentially a threat to their monetary systems, international payments. And now we've added this concern about the environment, something we've had for a long time. And so, especially in the post-COVID world, if you are becoming an increasingly large asset that is not satisfying broader social goals, I don't think that is a recipe for more stability. I think it's a recipe for less stability.
Mark, thanks so much. As always, Mark Haefele, their Chief Investment Officer at UBS Global Wealth Management. Now, we're just getting some breaking news out of Benjamin Netanyahu, talking about Iran, but also talking about Hamas, saying if Hamas breaks the calm, the response will be very powerful. That feels like a threat. We also see Anthony Blinken talking, flanked, of course, by Mr. Netanyahu. The Israeli Prime Minister is commenting after a meeting with the U.S. Secretary of State. So we'll see whether the tone of voice coming from Mr. Blinken is supportive of what we just heard from Mr. Netanyahu, also saying that the Iran deal is paving the way for Iran to have nuclear weapons. Now, coming up, Bloomberg's Stephanie Flanders will be speaking exclusively to the German Finance Minister Olaf Scholz, who's running for Chancellor in the upcoming German elections. So you don't want to miss that. It's at 6 a.m. in New York, 11 a.m. in London, on Live Go on the Bloomberg terminal. We'll have plenty of analysis of what the Greens are doing at the moment and who potentially the next Chancellor of Germany will be. This is Bloomberg. Well, this is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Francine Lacqua in London, Matt Miller in Berlin, Kailey Leinz in New York. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg. First word news, and U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren is proposing to nearly triple the IRS's budget to help identify wealthy individuals cheating on their taxes. Now, the Democrat senator wants the IRS to get a mandatory, stable annual budget of $31.5 billion and remove the agency from the annual Congress appropriations approval process. The Treasury Department says added enforcement could capture an additional $700 billion in tax dollars. Now, the entire world has been battling the same virus for over a year, but the quality of life and control of the pathogen spread looks vastly different depending on where you are. There's a shakeup at the top of Bloomberg's COVID resilience ranking, with last month's #1 Singapore falling in May, along with other Asian economies. In contrast, the US and parts of Europe have been steadily climbing up the ranking as the pandemic slowly recedes and vaccination numbers climb. Now, the UK jumps 7 spots to 11th. The US is number 13. New Zealand actually taking the top spots. Now, coming up next, we look at markets. We talk Bitcoin, treasuries, and equities with Valentin van Neuvenhuizen. He's NN Investment Partners Chief Investment Officer. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Surveillance, early edition. I'm Francine Lacqua in London, Matt Miller in Berlin, Kailey Leinz in New York. Now, there's quite a lot going on in the markets, Matt. I know you're dying to talk about Bitcoin. We've been talking about it day in, day out. Maybe we could move it to Ether or NFTs. Ronaldo is what I'm watching with Juventus and rumors. He actually tweeted a very cryptic tweet saying that it's not the records that he's chasing. The records chase him, but he could be done at Juventus. Speculation, but one of the big stories.
I don't chase records, records chase me. I love that quote. It's almost like a Chuck Norris thing. Maria Tadeo, who is actually our Ronaldo expert, she's a Ronaldo super fan, says very few teams can actually afford him because eyebrow waxing has become so expensive here in Europe that he needs a really high, like multi-100 million euro salary. I'm also watching Bitcoin. I just get tired of the Musk tweets driving. And to be honest, for me, under 40,000 is a little bit depressing. I bought my first Bitcoin for $600, so under 40,000 seems like I've made almost no returns on that.
Yeah, if only you remembered your password. I feel like if Bitcoin was a person, they would have probably tweet what Ronaldo tweeted, but we digress. Kailey, what are you seeing on the markets?
Oh, I'm chasing the markets. Not sure if the market's chasing me, though, Francine. We are on an up day on both sides of the Atlantic right now. Stocks in Europe are higher by about 0.4%. And, of course, it was big tech that led the way in the U.S. yesterday. Looks like it will be the case come the opening bell in about 4 hours' time today as well, with NASDAQ 100 futures up about 0.5%. Of course, this is as inflation fears seem to be coming out of the market a bit, and we are seeing yields moving lower by a basis point. We are sub 1.59% on the U.S. 10-year Treasury yield. And I know, Matt, I'm sorry, I know you're tired of talking about it. Bitcoin is sub 40,000 right now at $38,000, though still higher than it was yesterday before Elon Musk tweeted about his meeting with some of those miners. Now, as for what that's doing to cryptocurrency-tied stocks and pre-market trading, it's a bit mixed. Coinbase is higher by the better part of 2%, but Riot Blockchain, which is a miner, is lower by about 1.5%. Of course, Square is tied to the Bitcoin story as well, but it may be moving more on the fact that it's potentially planning checking and savings accounts that may enable it to compete with the likes of JP Morgan. So that stock is higher by 1% in early hours. And then, of course, the ARK Innovation ETF, Cathie Wood's flagship fund, is the poster child for tech and the momentum trade. And with the gains we are seeing in big tech broadly this morning, Matt, it is higher by about 1.2% before the bell.
I know they were buying Bitcoin.
Indeed.
I also know that Musk had a meeting with Saylor as well as the people at Hut 8 about mining in a more sustainable way. I think it's very interesting how many people own Bitcoin. You know, millennials, 20% of millennials hold some crypto assets, 15% of Gen Z. So maybe as you get younger, it gets less interesting. I am looking at outflows of Bitcoin. I've always been following this ETP, exchange traded product at CoinShares. It allows you to buy Bitcoin and then they hold it for you. So you can't lose your password as some people have done. Outflows, right now we're in the 7th month. It's pretty amazing, although the people at CoinShares say they think this is holders taking profits after they've made more than 1,000% return. So they've done well, but the point is they're getting out of this ETP, this exchange traded product. And to me, Fran, that says a lot.
It does say a lot. Now, joining us to talk about this and more is Valentin van Neuvenhuizen. He's Chief Investment Officer at NN Investment Partners. Valentin, thank you, as always, for joining us on Bloomberg Surveillance. When you look at some of the talk about crypto, so you believe it's here to stay, but in what form?
Well, I think that's the question we're all actually asking, right? It's here to stay. Technology-wise, as an integral part of our global payment system, blockchain will be there, and cryptocurrencies and other crypto applications through tokens, through other stable coins attached to, maybe traditional currencies, other assets, regular equities, new types of asset classes. Think about carbon, for example. There's all kinds of options that we're sort of still inventing here. So, it's good to see the still ongoing enthusiasm on your side on the topic, given that we've just gone through quite a massive shakeout there. So. And I think there was one other point that you quickly discussed, which is the involvement of the younger generations. And I think there's been also in this COVID period, the sort of a rise of a new participants in financial markets, and not only in crypto space, but also in equities and other parts of more traditional financial markets who really stepped in, younger investors, and are really eager to explore.
Yeah, if you look at equity markets, for example, Valentin, is there anything that looks frothy? So we've heard, Janet Yellen, but also other central banks saying that they worry about these kind of valuations. What part of the market would you worry about?
Well, of course, they worry about valuations. We've heard that so many times. I think that on its own is not a reason to become negative. On the other hand, it is a point that we are also now weighing a bit more heavily. We've been overweighting equities globally for the last 6 months or so, and we've just this week neutralized that position. So I do think that, although I'm not worried that there is massive bubbles in the whole asset class, that we're seeing a pattern now sort of peaking out in May. It seems a bit more difficult to see real catalysts for equities in the near term to push them dramatically higher. And valuations are stretched. There's no other way to put it. But of course, they have found confirmation in the earnings numbers. But you could also see there that markets had basically already bought that rumor and now, to some extent, are selling the fact in May. So I think they are, I wouldn't say frothy, but they are rich in valuations. So maybe looking at it from a bit more of a neutral stance for now is the best way. But underneath, I think we shouldn't underestimate the power of the recovery that is still coming. Go ahead.
Where do valuations make sense right now? I mean, commodities have been off the hook, and that's really been a weight on the mega caps. I saw a great chart earlier showing, commodities going like this, pushing mega tech stocks down. But Mark Haefele from UBS earlier, he likes financials, he likes energy, and he says this reflation trade still gives those room to run.
Yeah, I do think, ever since basically Joe Biden got elected, or the first election results came out in early November, this trade has been put up in the market. I do think there's an element there of the more cyclical sectors that you refer to that has further to run. As I was saying, there's massive pent-up demand, I think, in domestic demand in all parts of the developed world that will be unleashed over the next, let's say, 6 to 12 months, supporting those more traditional cyclical elements in the market. So I do think there's maybe a bit more upside on these sectors, but it doesn't take away the fact that the secular growth area is still in technology. And whether that is linking it to Bitcoin, any other of the new fintech technologies and payment systems, or whether it's just linking it to its better positioning also around this other critical theme, which is sustainability. I think that's where, in the medium to long term, really the growth opportunities still are.
In the near term, though, it does seem to be this reflation narrative, at least in the equity market. But what about in the bond market? Yeah. We have been stuck in this range on the 10-year Treasury yield for some time now. When and why will we see a breakout of that?
Well, it's a good point. And it's maybe also why now in the equity market in recent days, for example, the market is wondering a little bit whether this reflation trade is continuing. U.S. Treasuries have been peaking out clearly and sort of range trading in a 1.5 to 1.7 range for some time. You did see some further increase in European yields, so it's not completely gone away. This sort of drift up in yields and build up in inflation expectations. But for now, I think it's sort of peaking out. So we're reflecting a little bit. But I think if you look at the actual numbers, the inflation numbers that are still likely to come out, there's a lot of uncertainty. We might see a couple of other upside surprises there. So I don't think we're really at the end there. And therefore, I wouldn't be surprised if we move up a bit further, getting German yields closer to positive territory and getting US yields a bit up. But I do think we've seen most of the sell-off in treasury markets.
Valentin, thank you so much. We'll have to get you back on to look at treasuries. Valentin van Nieuwenhuizen, their Chief Investment Officer at NN Investment Partners. Now, coming up next, the EU vowing more penalties for Belarus. We'll speak with an expert on post-communist Europe. She's Anne Applebaum, Johns Hopkins Senior Fellow. That's coming up next, and this is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. You're looking live at the principal room. Coming up later today, Mary Erdos, JP Morgan Asset and Wealth Management CEO. This is Bloomberg.
What has happened here, this is unseen.
It's an international scandal.
I think hijacking the plane and behaving like that, it is the act of terror.
The European Council decided that there will be additional sanctions on individuals that are involved in the hijacking, but this time also on businesses and economic entities that are financing this regime.
Particularly also against companies, so therefore we need more economic sanctions and entities supporting the regime.
We need clear actions in order to change the pattern of behavior of this very dangerous regime.
EU leaders are vowing sanctions against Belarus after the country forced a plane landing to arrest a dissident journalist. Now, we're back with, of course, this important story. And Anne Applebaum in The Atlantic writes, authoritarian states in pursuit of their enemies no longer feel the need to respect passports, borders, diplomatic customs, or now the rules of air traffic control. In autocratic capitals all over the world, dictators and their flunkies are also watching to see how the West reacts and whether perhaps this new tool of oppression will become available to them too. Well, Anne is Senior Fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian who's written extensively about the development of civil society in Central and Eastern Europe, and we're delighted to be joined by Anne right now. And first of all, it's incredible when you look at the events in the last 3 days, but also in the last 5 years. It seems that big democracies cannot or will not shape the world order anymore. Do presidents and leaders like Lukashenko just feel like they face no peril at all?
I don't know it's that they feel that they face no peril, but they look at and they see a democratic world that's divided. Under President Trump, the United States was only a kind of half-hearted member of that world. It no longer saw itself as a leader of the democracies. Trump himself preferred the company of oligarchs and dictators, and he made that fairly clear. He didn't like going to meetings of democratic leaders, and the democratic camp feels ragged around the edges. And I think that has allowed not just the Belarusians, but the Russians, the Chinese, the Saudis, and others to try things that would have been considered impossible a few years ago, poisoning people in London or in Salisbury, attacking and murdering a Saudi dissident in a consulate in Turkey. These are new kind of breaking new ways of autocrats reaching their dissidents and exiles that we wouldn't have imagined some years ago.
And is the West response to Belarus strong enough? Or actually, as long as Russia supports Lukashenko, will it have little to no effect?
It's true that another aspect of the new world order, or the emerging world order, is that while the democracies are divided, the autocracies stick together, and they've proven that they're willing to come to the aid of one another when they're experiencing sanctions or pressure from the West. Belarus is a special situation because it's not a country that has a huge amount of clout outside of, away from Russia, and it doesn't even have a huge amount of clout inside Russia. It's becoming very dependent on Russia, having had a relatively successful, relatively strong economic growth over the last couple of decades. It's now in real crisis. And there is a question about how long Russia will prop it up. And there are, of course, other economic interests inside Belarus. And the question is how long Belarusian businesses will continue to support a dictator who is increasingly really only interested in his personal survival. He doesn't seem to care much about the country. He's not interested in the welfare of his citizens. And he's not interested in the business community either, as this hijacking demonstrates. I mean, you don't force a plane out of the sky, a commercial airliner, and not expect any consequences, and he must have expected them.
And I get a lot of messages from, I would guess, the right wing in America who say the weakness of Biden is seen by, for example, immigrants who no longer have concerns with coming up through the Mexico-U.S. border, or Hamas that has no reasons no concerns about lobbing rockets back into Israel, or this kind of move. Now, you mentioned a few issues that we saw by autocrats, by dictators during the Trump administration as well. But do you see the administration change affecting what autocrats think they can and cannot do?
I think it's really too early to make any definitive comment about this administration. It hasn't made any gestures yet that are significant in this direction. Most of what we're watching now is still the backwash from the Trump administration, which was, I mean, I really can't emphasize this enough, played a really important role in undermining the unity of the Democratic camp, such as it still is. The European-American relationship, the relationship between America and Asian democracies, all of that is still being felt. And of course, around the world, most democracies even are still curious and wondering about the United States. What will it return to a leadership role? Can it? How long will this, how long will a Democratic presidency last? So I think I think it's early to say. I mean, the Biden administration has said that it would like to reconsolidate democracy and would like to work together with allies to push back against autocracies. It's true that we haven't seen much in that direction yet, but I hope we will.
Can the West really face Putin if Berlin is willing to funnel billions and billions of euros directly to Russia through the Nord Stream 2 pipeline? I mean, can you really sanction, a dictator as you fund his activities?
Well, I would separate two things. I would separate Belarus and Russia. Yes, I do think that Western action can have an impact on Belarus. Russia is much more difficult. It's a much bigger country. And as you say, it has interests all over Europe as well as the United States. And that's a very good question. There are sanctions on Russia, but do the sanctions matter? Can they hurt? If we still have extensive business dealings with Russia, not only through the pipeline, but through money laundering operations, banking operations, and all kinds of other ways in which Western economies are codependent on Russia. And yes, I think a stepping back, a looking at the way in which we are complicit in keeping dictators like Putin in power would be a really useful project, and it's one I do hope the Biden administration undertakes.
If the Lukashenko-Putin relationship grows a bit closer out of this episode, is the opposition in Belarus weakened or strengthened?
The opposition in Belarus, whom I have spoken to, very much want these sanctions. They want Lukashenko to be isolated. They're hoping that both pressure from Russia, but also from within the country, will help ease Lukashenko out of power. But yes, I mean, your point is something that is a danger. Lukashenko is increasingly entirely dependent on Russia. He's grown closer and closer to the Putin regime. Of course, that also makes his personal position weaker in some ways. If Putin changes his mind about Lukashenko, and they haven't been, sort of mutual admirers of one another in the past. They've fallen out over many issues before. And if Putin now removes his support, that would be the end of Lukashenko.
Anne Applebaum, thank you so much, of course, of John Hopkins. And you should read everything that Anne writes on the subject. Also on Twitter. Now, coming up, Deutsche Bank's nightmare decade is gone but not forgotten. We'll chart the firm's fall from grace and its impressive turnaround. It's our big take. It's coming up next. And this is Bloomberg.
Good Tuesday morning. This is Bloomberg Surveillance Early Edition. I'm Matt Miller in Berlin with Francine Lacqua in London and Kailey Leinz in New York. Now, deemed once the sick man of European finance, Deutsche Bank's days of dysfunction have finally retreated under the leadership of CEO Christian Sewing. Deutsche Bank's annual general meeting is Thursday, and Sewing is expected to highlight the turnaround at Germany's largest lender. We've taken a closer look at the recent changes at Deutsche in today's big take on the Bloomberg terminal and website. If you're a subscriber, if you're a client, just type NI Big Take Go. Joining us now for more is Stephen Arons. He's covered Deutsche Bank for years for us out of Frankfurt. So what has Sewing done, Stephen, that has worked? He's had so many predecessors try and fail.
Yeah, that's really the big question that we're trying to answer. What's different this time? And one thing that is different now is that this infighting at the top of Deutsche Bank, which really blocked the banks for years, that has stopped. It's really aligned. And it does what the CEO says. He unveiled a new strategy 2 years ago and actually went to execute that. That was different previously, too. There were many CEOs who had big plans but failed to implement them properly. This has now happened. But, and this is important, too, Sewing has also been extremely lucky. The trading boom that's been going on, it's buoyed many investment banks, has been helping Deutsche Bank as well. And that's also a big difference to before, when Deutsche Bank was suffering from a lull in trading for many years.
I remember, Stephen, years ago, you'd speak to people in the corridor in Frankfurt and then be like, why would anyone actually want that job? I know, we ask ourselves, is this now a more normal bank? Normal is difficult to define, but is it actually definitely in a better footing on the right path?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the story my colleagues and I, we wrote shows just how different it is. It's the first story ever, it feels to me, that that's sort of a positive story about Deutsche Bank, if you will. And so we're trying to show there was a decade where Deutsche Bank was just seen as sort of the sick man in European finance, and that is not longer the case. It's still not a profitable bank. It still has a long way to go, but it's not the sick bank anymore, I think.
All right, no longer a basket case. Stephen, thanks so much. Bloomberg's Stephen Arons there. You can check out our Big Take story on Bloomberg.com or also on the terminal NI Big Take Go. It's a really good one, so go and check it out. Now, coming up, Bloomberg's Stephanie Flanders will be speaking exclusively to the German Finance Minister Olaf Scholz, who's running for Chancellor in the upcoming German election. So we'll have a full roundup of everything Germany in a couple of minutes. 6 a.m. in New York, 11 a.m. in London. This is Bloomberg.